Genial.
Perfecto.
¿Quieren que empecemos? No sé si está Gadi, el técnico oficial,
Sí.
para grabar y para empezar a transmitir. Bueno. Carly, empezá.
No, ya ahí comentamos lo que vamos a hacer, es presentarlo. Yo primero,
Bueno,
gracias por aceptar la invitación, por conversar de esto con nosotros. Para nosotros también esta es la primera vez que yo hace mucho que estoy en el curso de Historia 1, con alumnos de segundo año, que damos desde el Renacimiento hasta el Crystal Palace. Y este año tomé este curso, es la primera vez que tomo este curso de Historia 3, son estudiantes más avanzados, así que bueno, muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación, les agradezco a Cecilia Pellegrini, a Gadi Ulanowski, a Gadiel y a Nico Ventroni, que con ellos estamos trabajando mucho para llevar este año adelante, así que bueno, y muchas gracias, Filip, por estar y por aceptar la invitación.
First of all, thank you for inviting us, both us, Fala, and the students from Lisbon. And I truly apologize for not doing the talk in Spanish, but I think for everyone's mental health, it would be better if we either do it in Portuguese or English. So we agreed on doing it in English, so I'm going to give my best to speak slowly also, so that I try to be as clear as possible. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share a PDF.
Felipe,
yes.
I would like to introduce you first a little.
Sorry.
The studio. Thank you. Bueno, voy a presentar muy brevemente para poner en contexto. Bueno, hoy comenzamos este ciclo de charla con Fala Atelier para reflexionar sobre el dibujo en arquitectura como herramienta proyectual y pedagógica. Tenemos acá a Felipe y a sus estudiantes del Instituto Universitario de Lisboa, mejor conocidos en Instagram como a Turma Mais Fish. Así que, bueno, los presento y les cuento un poco por qué fue el primer estudio en el que pensamos cuando surgió la idea de hablar de arquitectura contemporánea. Fala es un estudio de arquitectura localizado en Porto, en Portugal, que está formado por 3 socios, Felipe Magalhães, Ana Luisa Suárez y Ahmed Belcocha. Los 3 trabajaron con Harry Google en Basilea, en Suiza, y vivieron en Tokio. Felipe trabajó con Saná, Luisa con Toyo Ito y Ahmed en Atelier Bau Bau. Los Fala, que en portugués significa charla informal, se autodefinen como postmodernos y como una combinación de curiosidad, juventud ambiciosa, ingenuidad cínica y falta de seriedad. En medio de la simultaneidad y la fugacidad actuales, con tanta información disponible y tantas verdades como uno quiera encontrar, esto nos dice mucho de cómo logran inventarse sus propias verdades y sus propias reglas del juego, y siempre son más divertidas. Eso es una de las cosas más interesantes que tienen. Parece que siempre están jugando. Y si bien hay algo indiscutiblemente lúdico en sus trabajos, también es verdad que atrás de cada planta, de cada color elegido, en cada collage, en cada decisión, por más despreocupada y simple que parezca, hay mucho. Hay mucho tiempo de dibujo de pensamiento, hay mucha reflexión histórica y crítica, y hay una obsesión por la forma y la geometría. Entre muchas otras cosas, esto es lo que convierte sin duda a Fala en un excelente reflejo de una generación, de una arquitectura pensada por una generación. Fala se reconoce en esta cultura en la que coleccionamos imágenes a la velocidad del scroll, cada vez con menos etiquetas y menos prejuicios. En el primer dibujo, cada uno de sus proyectos actúa sobre estas referencias, de Sisa, de Venturi, de David Hockney, de Jeff Wall, por nombrar solo algunos de sus héroes. Trabajan en el limbo, dicen ellos, entre arquitectura y arte, en este in-between entre el dibujo y la obra construida, entre lo abstracto y lo figurativo. Fala piensa a partir de estas citas que colecciona, las intercala a modo de collage y así crea y nos regala estas arquitecturas desprejuiciadas y por ende mucho más libres. Así que, sin más, ahora sí, Felipe, cuando quieras, todo tuyo.
Muchas gracias.
A
And this
ustedes.
is where my Spanish ends. So I'm going to share my screen, and just let me know if you can see. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Sí.
So there's a PDF saying Fala, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So once again, thank you for this invitation and for the huge responsibility of being the first in a lecture series. It's always easier when someone else already defined the tone, but well, I'm going to give my best. And thank you also for including on this conversation not only our practice, but also the students, the second-year students of our class last year in Lisbon. They are in the middle of the audience now. They are camouflaged. And in the end, I think it would be interesting to also hear their feedback on what I'm going to present. As I said, before we went live, I'm going to divide the presentation in 2 blocks. The first block is about our practice in Porto. It's about Fala. And the second block is about let's say, the academic activities we did last year with our students, analyzing directly the final results of the final projects that were produced. So, first block, Fala. Well, we already had an amazing introduction, but I could say in specific that we are a very young, small practice based in Porto. So we are 8 people now. We are all very young, so I'm the oldest in the office. I'm 33, so it's a practice that is still, to a large extent, in the beginning, I would say. So we are still grasping what being an architect is. It's a practice that is based in a very strange context. In a way, we have outstanding architects practicing around us, Cisa, Sotomayor, and a few others after them. We have a huge history behind us, a huge legacy to work with. But we were, let's say, we started our practice after the big crisis from 2010. We started our practice in the midst of gigantic economical bubble, a very speculative environment. And we mostly take on the commissions that the, let's say, proper architects don't. So most of our clients, they don't really care about architecture. They don't really care about design. They just care about, building their house in the cheapest, fastest, Pinterest compatible way they imagine. So it is important to start by saying that most of the architecture we produce is an architecture that was not asked for. So many times our projects, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different layers, being the first layer, of course, the response to the program, to the client. So to give the client what the client asks for. So if he asks for a house, we don't give him a museum. We design a house and we respect the program. We are very pragmatic in that sense. At the same time, we need to give the municipality and the legal institutions the practicalities they request, this regulations, the distances, the very boring understanding of what a city should be. And then we have all our other layers, so the layers that interest us at Fala. So as a practice, we understand that we provide a service, but at the same time, we have our own personal authorial interests, and we want to explore them in every project. So be them big commissions or small commissions, be these projects with big budgets or small budgets, we always try as much as possible to see each of them as a let's say, ongoing opportunity to try something new, to try something a bit bolder, a bit more radical, to, expand our own in-house research. And what I have on the screen now is a print screen from our website, from our homepage. Our website is probably one of the least comfortable and practical websites on the internet. And it's not by mistake, it's actually carefully calculated to be like that. But the homepage pretty much summarizes how we see our practice. There's no hierarchy, there's not a main project and secondary projects. There's a very deliberately open mix pool of all the projects put together, be them interior projects, new buildings, old buildings, ongoing work, built work, sometimes demolished work. Everything is just flattened into one platform. And the non-linear display we present on the website is a bit how we see our own practice. There are the projects, of course. We did houses, we did apartments, we did shops, we did whatever. But there's also those elements, those tropes, those, let's say, those themes that run through the projects in parallel. So the first thing I would like to start by saying, and before digging into the presentation, is our practice can be seen in several axes. So there's the different layers of pragmatism, from the client to the municipality to our own interest as authors. And there's also the themes in the projects, from the program to the typology to the tropes to the colors to the textures to the surfaces, etc., etc. And today I would like to talk about drawings. I would like to talk about drawings both as lenses. So let's say the focal length that allows us to look at something in a project, in a building, in an idea, and to look at drawings as tools. And because architecture is produced through drawings, and drawings are many things. Drawings are not just plans, sections, or collages. They can be many other things, and I'm going to focus on that. And I would like to address this concept that the lens, so the way as we look at a drawing, can become a tool, and that a certain tool of a certain drawing can become a lens to look at the project. And I think it might be a bit confusing as a start, as a title, but I believe that during the presentation it will become clear what I mean. And this is a very nice quote from Ettore Sottsass that says that, you know, the exact same word in two different languages means something slightly different. And it takes the example of the word love in English and amore in Italian. And although I don't speak Italian, I kind of understand what it means, because in Portuguese, the word saudade, for example, is a word that is not translated in any other language in a way that truly describes what it means for someone from Portugal. And taking this as a kind of metaphysical reference, I would like to start by saying that by all means, we start by sketching. On any project, any idea, any discussion, any debate around the table has draft paper, old prints, envelopes, you know, backs of boxes sketched upon. And these sketches, they are not the Caesar sketch, they are not the Porto School sketch, they are not that simulation of a perspective. It's more of a diagrammatic sketch. It's more about this, the way we sketch reflects the way how we think, and the way how we think, it's to a large extent schematic, it's diagrammatic, it's to a large extent trying to explain how a certain spatial system is going to come alive. And every time we start a discussion, be it about a detail of construction in the execution phase, or about the massing of a volume in the beginning of the concept phase, takes a lot of these pages. So many times we don't publish them, or I would say we pretty much don't publish them at all, but they are the, let's say, the first sparkle of the creative process. And they take many forms, of course, but mostly they take the form of plans. And plans are, in our eyes, very dry mathematical equations. You know, they have the exact proportions, they have the exact relations between certain programs, they address typology, program, area. They have a very clear set of intentions displayed into them. So by looking at a plan, one can understand how much a certain room is more important than the others, how equal rooms relate to each other, how exceptions come alive. And we like to draw our plans always in what we call single line drawings. And single line drawings are, as the name suggests, drawings where every single constructive element is reduced to one single line. So the thickness of the exterior wall and the thickness of the interior wall becomes the same. This does not mean that when we do a proper construction document, we don't draw them properly. Yes, we do. But those are the drawings everyone does and everyone knows about. These are our specific plans. These are the plans we do inside the office as a practice to communicate with each other. So these are drawings that often don't go out of the practice, that they don't leave the walls of our practice. They stay inside. And these are the plans we draw to communicate with each other. And why not having any thicknesses? Because when we remove the thicknesses, the only thing we are left with are the relations between the rooms. And let's face it, many of the buildings we build, they are built with very low budgets, with very complex conditions many times. As I said before, our clients, they don't care that much about what we do. So construction is very often an invention, an improvisation, something we have to adapt. But the inner structure, the spatial structure of our projects, that's what we don't want to compromise. That's what we don't want to negotiate. So these plans, they summarize, these plans, they summarize all of our intentions for the project within a very limited set of graphical elements, a very few set of line thicknesses, dashed lines, continuous lines, very few colors. And actually these plans are all drawn in black and white except for the pavements. So they somehow give us everything we are going to care about during the construction process. So everything can change, but this structure remains. But these plans, despite their apparent simplicity, have a lot of other layers of complexity into them. One of them is defined by the base grid. A base grid is something we are truly, let's say, addicted to. A base grid, as you can see here with dashed yellow lines, is what defines the rhythm, is what somehow holds together, in this case, a perimeter that was given to us. The blue lines, they represent rules. And every plan needs to have rules. You know, a plan without rules is not a plan at all. A plan that is just randomly drawn one wall at a time, one door at a time, it's something we cannot bear. It's not our way of thinking, our way of working. But a good rule needs a good exception, therefore red lines. The red lines, they somehow represent the exceptions that break the system and somehow make it even more valuable. And as you can see, for example, in this case, this is a plan that starts from, you know, the discovery of certain columns that were pre-existing in black. Everything that is black was somehow already there. And the discovery of a certain grid that then accepts a certain exception. And when we go back to the plan again, we understand that that exception solves the bathrooms. It somehow distinguishes what is a 3-bedrooms apartment from a 2-bedrooms apartment. And it very importantly creates an axis in the center that is slightly off-centered from the columns. And on the top left corner, you can see a couple of green dashed lines that represent proportion. Proportion is also very important for us in the sense that if we have a room that is nearly a square, it has to be a square. If we have an angle that is nearly 45 degrees, it has to be 45 degrees. And a circle is not an oval, and an oval will never be a circle. So for us, it's very important to somehow compress these different readings, the rule, the grid, the exception, the proportion, into a very simple and dry single line drawing. And this is something that runs through all the drawings we do. So every time we draw a plan, a section, an elevation, we are deeply focused on emphasizing these qualities, the repetition of the rule, the grid, the exception. And somehow when we put all the plans at the same scale side by side with these graphical codes, we can find points in common. We can understand what connects certain projects, and we can also understand what detaches them, what pulls them apart. And it's very refreshing for us, you know, many times 2, 3, 4, 5 years after we did a certain project, to put it side by side with something we have on the table now and to understand that we are just reinventing a certain spatial concept that we worked with years before. But as I said, this is, let's say, the second step. The first step is the sketch, the second step is the plan, and the third step is to understand what does this mean on a 3-dimensional level. And we produce a lot of 3D models, and very different 3D models. So we produce 3D models that are meant, you know, just to take some quick renders to show to a client. We produce 3D models that are meant to somehow help us build a physical model or to help us, you know, communicate with each other certain volumetric studies. But mostly we like to look at the 3D model as a possibility to explore on a 3-dimensional axis the same set of rules and exceptions we were working with on the plan before. So these 3Ds, they are not meant to be beautiful. They are not meant to be, let's say, magazine material. They are not meant to be found on Pinterest one of these days. They are just what we need to do in order for, let's say, to convince ourselves that a certain idea, that a certain project is actually following the narrative and the structure we want to. And these drawings, they show up many times on the computer programs. They just pop out almost bluntly, as you can see here. These are just very dry print screens, but they are fundamental to us because they put in context that plan by giving it a section that is not just a section, that is, everyone does sections, we do sections, but I don't think it's that relevant to show a section for us because in our process, the section is pretty much replaced by this three-dimensionality. So it doesn't matter, it matters a lot to me, or to us, that the plan itself is a set of rules that will structure the thinking of the whole house. You know, the way how you draw a plan will impact dramatically the way how people will live and occupy a space. But when it goes to the section, it's more interesting for us to see the full thing at once, and not just a specific moment where there's a double height space. You know, sections usually are just made for that, to explain where the slab is not parallel to the floor. And in our case, we like to work it in a more, let's say, environmental perspective. And of course, when the plan starts to be kind of defined, when the rules are in place, and when we see these models, it's very logical for us to give the next step, to take this print screen, to put some textures, to add some color, you know, to draw in a more, let's call it, literal way. So to look at the space as a space is going to be perceived. But as you know, these perspectives, they are a lie, in the sense that they are not reality. You know, that cat is not that cat, and that color is not that color. So they live in limbo. These collages, they are just print screens with a lot of textures on Photoshop, and a few objects and a few moments that suggest a certain occupancy, or a certain lifestyle, or a certain idea of occupation, but they are not in any way reality. They are just, let's say, the nemesis of the plan. If the plan, as I said, is very dry and mathematical, so it gives you the facts, so it gives you numbers, the collage gives you feelings. It's like, it's something that touches you on the inside. It's something that makes you react automatically to it and say yes or no. And the plan, no, the plan, you know, you can discuss it, you can argue, you can send a plan to the other side of the planet, to someone who does not speak your language, and you can measure it. The collage is the opposite of that. You need to understand what you're looking for. You need to understand, you know, the narrative that led to that specific point, that led to that specific collage. You need to understand what that color stands for. Why is the ceiling not the same color as the floor? And at some point, detaching yourself from the fact that this is a ceiling and a floor, and start looking at this as a bidimensional composition, that is how we're going to perceive the world of that, let's say, inner construction a few months later, or a few years later. And of course, the collage is not something that is limited to an inside creation. It also has something to say about how we address the public space. How do we address the universe that surrounds us outside our building? And the collage, when that happens, somehow says something about the city, says something about public space. It says something about, you know, how the sun does its own sunset behind our buildings. And it's very important to us that these collages, they not just present the project, they are not just, in this case, for example, an elevation that was colored to look nicer. It's also something about, they say something about the neighbors, how they will react to this facade. What are these two ladies talking about? Are they saying good things or bad things? Probably bad things. They probably don't like the project. But honestly, that's something we believe to be important to address on the first stage. And keep in mind, everything we are showing you on this PDF today, we show to clients. It's a common question. Do you show these drawings to clients? Yes, we do. Because clients, they don't know that collages exist. They don't know that models exist. They don't know that, you know, post-digital collages exist. So it's very easy for us to show the tools we want, and I will show a lot more tools after. But if the client understands what we're trying to address, that's the point. So in that sense, each of the drawings I showed until now, and this one also, is a tool, because it helps us to produce the project. It helps us to discuss it among ourselves. But it's also a lens, because it gives you a very different imprint from the building, as if you just do an elevation, or if you build a model, or if you do something else. And as I said, the collage is a tool. So very often we only publish publicly the collages of the final projects, as you have here, for example, on the bottom right, the final, let's say, the final stage of this project. But during a normal project, we can produce, I don't know, thousands of versions of the same JPEG file. And sometimes they are about small refinements. So it's the same collage with small adjustments, just to try to really calibrate a project. Other times, like in this case, it's just crazy. Every collage is telling a different story, and every day we produce 20 of them, and each of them is just, you know, gravitating in a different direction. And that helps us, you know, the 8 of us or the 10 of us, when we are 10, to just understand exactly how far can we go and how far do we want to go. But as I said, the collage is not the final output. The collage is just a tool, and the tools, they don't end when the project is finished. The tools end when the building is finished, when the building is built. And many times we don't build nice models. Actually, I must say our models are terrible most of the times. They are not meant for museums. They are just, you know, tools for, let's say, either client meetings or the illustration of our thoughts. And many times the model takes shows up in two very different moments. In the beginning, and you can see on the left, we have very simple model studies and pattern studies for the tallest shower we built until today. And you see there's a common theme between all of them. There's a certain pattern, there's a certain proportion, but let's say all of them are okay. You know, if we had built one instead of the other, it would be perfectly fine. But it is also a model, the building. So the actual building, once it's built, and or at least during its construction, it is the one-to-one model we use the most, where we test textures, where we test materials, where we test the glossiness of the paint we were going to apply on the concrete. So a model is not just a beautiful decorated box we do for a presentation. It is also the building until the moment where it becomes inhabited. And we like to show this slide precisely to express these two extremes, the very early concept and the very late material testing. And we render a lot. We render a lot. So there's nothing in our practice against rendering. And there should not be, because renders are absolutely amazing tools. They provide us a degree of realism and precision that a collage and a plan and a section can't. And they provide us an image that a client can understand, because they understand the collages. And the collage usually shows up before, because the collage is a bit detached from reality. It's kind of lightheaded. It is everything the project should be, but it's not somehow limited. It's not somehow closing the project. It leaves the project in limbo. So it's an element that somehow gives you the main idea of a project, but does not close it. So in a collage, you're not going to discuss a handle. In a collage, you're not going to discuss the detail of a handrail. In the collage, you're not even going to discuss exactly the colors you're going to use. So a client that sees a collage understands the macro scale idea of a project. But once you start defining the project, and much later than the collage, once you are building the project or doing the execution documents for construction, you need to test these things. So at that moment, it becomes truly important to understand how the wood is going to connect with a stone, and on the pavement is going to connect with a wall. And then the rendering becomes a very valuable tool, because it gives us very precise answers very fast. So in 5 minutes, I can produce 10 small, simple renders, change a color, change a texture, add glossiness, you know, move an object around, and quickly see if that idea is actually working as we imagine it would be. And sometimes, as I said, it's just about small refinements. Maybe an idea for a facade is very, 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 very precise, but not precise enough to the point it cannot be even more refined. And for example, in this case, these 3Ds, they show up before the final documents, the final construction documents, where we are just truly trying to understand where the stripe is going to go and where exactly that dot is going to be. And sometimes the 3D does not give you the answers. So as much as we want the 3D to tell us exactly what we want, it won't. And we should not make a decision based on the fact that today, at this time of the day, I actually like more this image than the other one, because taste is not how you produce architecture. Taste is exactly just that, taste. And there's good taste, bad taste. There are mood changes. So never make decisions based on taste. So what we do is that we test. We do models. We try to understand exactly what are the ambitions of the project. And as I said before, our models are terrible. In this case, they are just very simple printouts folded just around a nasty box. It's really, we are terrible with models. But then you go to a tool where you're not terrible, where you can have the precision to define the project to a point where everything is in its right place. So for example, this is a very narrow building. We are going to start construction now in Porto that has 2 facades with windows and 1 facade that for regulation purposes has to be blind. So the design of the facade is not facade 1, 2, and 3. It's the facade as one. And there's a system of paint. There are 3 tones of white. There's a system of big black dots that hide the small technical windows for the bathrooms and somehow suggest the idea that the side facade also has those, although it doesn't. There's a series of tiny, tiny black tile dots that give a second layer of the same set of contrasts. there are very thin marble, pink marble lines defining an equal distance between themselves, with a big one marking the main facade. And then when you overlap all of this, you have the system that define that composition. And as many 3Ds we could have done before, only when you go down to an actual 2D platform and you kind of precisely try to draw everything the right dimensions, you get the final result. And in the end, there are the exceptions, like the crowning, the rain pipe, the shutters, the entrance door. And this is what brings the project together. And then you use the collage, in this case, to test if that drawing you did works. And the collage, as I said, it's kind of vague, so it's a bit weird to say that we need to have the collage as a vague drawing and then produce it posteriori to the precise drawings. But that's exactly the point. After you have a very precise idea, you go back to the tool that is unprecise, and you look at it and you see if it works. It actually works, so fantastic. So many of these drawings, for example, this one that I showed before, we don't do them for the client. We did it for ourselves. We discussed the project with the client by showing this image first, and then we moved on to the renders. And that's it. And sometimes we do the opposite. We show drawings, we don't show collages, and we only show renders. Sometimes we don't show renders at all. As I said, tools are not exclusive. You use the tool you need for a certain purpose, and the tool is just as valuable as the result it produces. A tool that is done just as an illustration or something you do a posteriori of the project is just stupid. That makes no sense at all. And when we draw elevations, we like many times to detach them from their context. Maybe this has something to do with the fact that we do not like to relate to the context where our buildings fit in, or maybe because all the projects we did until today, they are in kind of not that interesting contexts. Maybe that's just it. But the point is, we like to detach them, we like to draw them all at the same scale, and for one reason or another that we cannot truly rationalize, we always show them with a pink background. So every exterior facade we ever design is presented at the same scale with a pink background. And that's how we compare them. That's how we go between them in the office. And we like to put them all together like this to understand what they have in common and what they don't. Many times our facades, they take the shape, they take the form of figures. They become somehow very labelable figures. Other times they are about patterns, and the patterns, they can be with stripes, they can be with dots, they can be with structures. Sometimes they're about grids, very simple grids that are missing a window, very banal 4 window grids, or just grids that repeat themselves while moving, while setting back from each other. Other times they are about systems, as I showed before. So a facade that is just a superimposition of different systems that in the end defines the composition as something bigger than just dots and lines and this and that. So the facade becomes one thing made of many small things. Other times they are just canvases. They are just plain white rectangles or white squares where you put stuff, a chimney, a door, a round window, a certain fronton, a certain pattern, and they become free. They become like very intuitive compositions. And other times, there's, even in both systems, I would say, there's always a big debate on how to end a facade. The free options on the top with a proud fronton. So there's an element that somehow cuts it in the relation with the sky. The ones below with a very systematic 45 degrees pitched roof. And it's not that one is better than the other. It's just that these two tend to be the options we use the most, and each project very naturally guides us towards one or the other. And talking about elevations, we also have to talk about what happens on the inside, because the projects we do, they are done with the same level of care on the street facade as they are on the inside space. And maybe this is because we have a deep fascination by a series of 1970s and 1980s Japanese architects that truly cared about it. Maybe because many of the projects we did in the beginning of our practice were interior projects, so there was no actual outside facade. Or maybe just because as an architect should care about every single space he designs, and probably that's just it. And in this case, ironically, for reasons we also cannot fully understand, we always depict them detached from their context. So we detach the main elevation of a certain space from the room it actually occupies, and we place it on top of a golden background. And many times these elevations, they are not just a wall. It's not just about a composition of elements on the wall. It's about certain elements like a column, or sometimes these are bidimensional, or sometimes they are three-dimensional elevations. So there's no, let's say, we don't like to limit ourselves by the section, and we don't like to limit ourselves by the traditional notion of what an elevation should be. And when the project is completely developed, and sometimes even already built, we like to create what we call the comprehensive drawings. So a drawing that in a single bidimensional surface expresses all the intentions of a certain project. So the project is not just about those spaces and those beautiful photos. It's also about a series of rhetoric intentions, and maybe by just putting them all together, no one can read them most of the time. So these drawings are mostly made for ourselves. They are kind of for in-house consumption, but they express clearly all the intentions that we had for a certain project. And it's very funny because although when we show them outside, they seem a bit out of place, like, what is this? What is this drawing trying to say? When we do them ourselves, it's very obvious, like we know exactly what we are trying to do, and inside the office, so when we talk with each other, it's very obvious that a drawing has to be this way or that way. So it's interesting to see how somehow there's a dialect that runs inside the office that is sometimes popping out to the outside, but truly only makes complete sense among us. And it's very funny to put this on the wall and to try to understand also the relations that these drawings have to each other as independent drawings themselves. Another thing that is very important, and it's a very important lens to work with, is photography. And photography takes many forms. The first form is, of course, during construction, like the depiction of the different stages of a project, and to understand that everything we did on the paper, everything we did as collages, everything we did before becomes, to a large extent, physical, becomes walls, becomes ceilings, becomes stones, becomes sand. So it is very important to us to follow the construction sites of our project and to understand the different stages they go through. The erasure phase, the first image I showed, where we remove things. The correction phase, where we add elements on top of after the demolition. So where we add walls, where we add beams, where we had plastic elements, spatial elements, carpentry elements, etc., etc. And sometimes there are elements that show up by accident, like a certain curve shows up because there was a problem we didn't think about, and suddenly there was also the opportunity, in order to solve that problem, to introduce an element that we never thought about before. There's a lot of readings on the, for example, on the ironic side of this project, that you see all of these columns. In the end, they will disappear inside the walls. I mean, you can see there that the column is going to be part of a wall, so you don't see the elements that hold the building. But then only at this moment in time you can take a photo that you see that this column here, that in the end is going to be very present in the middle of the living room, that is going to be a very active part of the space, is actually not holding anything. So it's very important for us to capture these specific moments during the construction process that tells a story that probably later we will not be able to narrate with the final construction photos. And at the same time, they provide us these funny moments, like when you have the overimposition of different grids on the facade. So there's a chessboard, there's a rhythm of windows, there's a rhythm of columns, there's the rhythm of those black triangles on the top, and they don't match. And ironically, for a couple of weeks, there's also the rhythm of the scaffolding that defines a layer on top of a layer on top of a layer, and gives us the ambition and the intention in a future project to try something like this. Of course, we also photograph the buildings once they are done. And we like to always photograph them in the same way, mostly empty, just with a couple of furniture elements that give you scale, that give you a referential of views, that give you a bit of life, in the sense that an empty space is, to a certain degree, an abstraction that is too far from reality. And we like to compare them. So photography allows us to emphasize what they have in common and to emphasize what distinguishes them. And in this case, for example, we have a set of photos that are just trying to express the relation between a detached element, be it a colorful door, a patterned floor, or a big strong column and beam from a white background. Or other times we like to do the photos that I believe no one else, no one that is normal does, like lying down on the floor of a bathroom or of a living room or of a patio and just looking at the sky and trying to understand, if we were to look at the world from this perspective, how would it look like? And after 20, 30 projects, we start finding a lot of points in common. So those projects, again, that were designed in different periods by different people in the office with different discussions, they end up having something in common, as if the 3 projects from left to right are actually just different stages of the lifespan of a building of the same project. At other times, we also like to see photography as a possibility to, let's say, extract from architecture maybe what we could call plastic arts, or let's say accidents, or let's say moments that, although never planned to be perceived individually, define or create a second layer or a third layer or a fifth layer of narrative, become, let's call it, full-time temporary installations, let's say. And it's very funny for us to extract this from projects that were not meant to be seen like that. For example, this is a very traditional single-family house for a very normal Portuguese couple. You know, nothing artistic was on the brief or the request, but in the end, the simple relation of the color of the ceiling with the structure of the roof became, let's call it the architecture that was not asked for, or in this case, the artistic expression that was not requested. And it's also very funny for us now that we start having buildings built from scratch, or buildings built in let's call it, in urban contexts that are very, very different from one another, to see how they relate to their surroundings. For example, this is a clothing factory that I transformed into a housing block in the suburbs from Porto, in a rural area. And it is very, very funny to see how it behaves almost as a Ellsworth Kelly cutout in the landscape, or a bit like a Baldessari negative, kind of. Or to understand the absolute opposite, how even in a very, very noisy context, our building can be a bit noisier than everyone around. Or to give a few steps back and to understand that our building is just a very, very, very small pixel for everyone else. It's very important for us, but in the daily life of the city, it's just a grain of sand in a big ocean. Other times we like to discuss this abstraction again from a normal perspective. So those photos I showed before of the beam, they are photos that, you know, no one finds if you don't look for them, but other times this abstraction finds itself very naturally placed as a corner of a garden that has no grass yet. And this kind of almost there condition is also very attractive to us. And once in a while, not very often, but it happened at least this time, we find ourselves in the weird position of building two buildings next to each other, and to be able to relate. You see that we often show 2 or 3 projects in the same slide at the same time, but this is the unique example of 2 projects at the same time in the same slide in the same photo. So 2 buildings that were designed and fought at different periods, but somehow relate to one another by just literally being Siamese somehow. So they are next to each other, they have different plans, different clients, different programs, different gardens, but they were forced to live and to coexist together, and we are very happy to see how that worked out. And other times this relation is to the neighbor we didn't plan. So to design a house in a also suburban area where the only request was for us to design a house, the only request from the client was for us to design a house that looked like a house. And we completely, as I said, ignored the context, just to find out years later, once we were depicting and photographing the building built, that it's actually almost like a young brother of the house that was there the whole time. And although it seems impossible that we did not notice this before, the truth is that we didn't. We made such an effort to run away from the context in which we were placing our building that we ended up pretty much, well, repeating the neighbor's building. And it was very funny for us to take this photo because it's a complete coincidence. Even the perspective itself. This was the last photo we took of the photo shoot of this building. And in the end, it's the one that makes the most sense. Although it has that round window that very mysteriously, it's a bit higher than a normal window and you don't really know what it stands for. And it looks like an elephant in elevation, kind of, a very abstract elephant. But more important than that, it is the neighbor without being the neighbor, and it's not a neighbor while being the neighbor. And moving to teaching. So as I said before, we had the opportunity to teach for the last few years, mostly with 4th and 5th year students, so grown-up students, let's say, students who know exactly what they want to do, what they want to stand for, you know, students that have convictions. And this year, for the first time, we had the opportunity to teach 2nd year students. And this was a very different approach in the sense that we are used to a certain set of discussions, and this forced us as professors to rethink everything we thought we knew for certain. And we were also lucky enough to have an amazing group of people, an amazing group of students that made sure that, let's say, the ambition we put into the exercise worked out. And this is the Turma Mais Fixe. So these are the heroes that made this exercise possible. And it's not by chance that we show a Zoom print screen, because this was also a very interesting and experimental academic year, in the sense that for the first semester we were together every week, twice a week for several hours. And for the second semester, after we developed a personal connection and a personal relation, we had daily or weekly Zoom calls. But I would say that when let's say the prime matter of the students is as good as we had this year, that's not a problem at all. So I don't think Zoom is going to kill architecture, as I heard many teachers say in the last year. I think it's about understanding how we can take advantage of it. And I believe I would not be talking to an Argentinian class today if Zoom or Google Hangouts or all of these new technologies would not be present. But the first thing I tried to bring to the students was this idea that architecture is not just about drawing construction documents for construction sites. Architecture is not about real estate promotion. Architecture is not about any of that. That's why those things have names. They have their own disciplines. Architecture is about a certain significance in the production of ourselves as individuals or ourselves as a practice, etc., etc. And this Calvin and Hobbes, let's say, cartoon is a perfect example of this. When the work is utterly incomprehensible, it is therefore full of deep significance. And one of the things we decided we did not want to do with our students was to avoid the obvious academic teaching. So there are things a student needs to know: how to draw a plan, how to draw an elevation, how to talk about proportion, how to talk about, Palladio. A student that doesn't know who Palladio is failing somehow. You have to, or in this case, to talk about Alberti. And this was there. And I think to a degree or another, everyone does this. But what we decided to do in parallel to this was to bring references that usually are not brought to them. And what I'm going to do now is to show a series of drawings and references and ideas we brought on the table. For example, in this case, you have on the left side a drawing of a house by Kitagawara, and on the right side, a project that came out of a student, or an element of a project that came out of a student that never visited this house, probably didn't even study it in detail, but somehow inherited from it certain qualities, certain references, certain, let's say, lessons. And it was very funny for us to understand how all of these references that were being given as a kind of metaphysical example became almost literal translations in the projects. And how, in many cases, it was about understanding, for example, the meaning space from Shinohara, that was about the void, and how Simão, in this case, managed to introduce a column in the center of that space. So the graphical tool was misunderstood, and by coincidence, it created a completely different reading and a completely different meaning from what the original architect was trying to do. It produced new content. And if Shinohara was talking about the void, Simão was talking about the totem that occupies the space. And at the same time, Mariana was playing with the same reference, but trying to reinterpret the dryness of that square space from Shinohara. If he was trying to be absolute, Mariana was trying to be playful and joyful. And it was interesting to see how the same tool was extrapolated in wrong ways, but so nicely. For example, again, bringing the renders from the fourth phase of Shinohara and those photos off the screen, and then looking at the kind of perspectives that we call this the bird perspective, like the seagull perspective of the project from Guilherme, Mariana, and Nico. It was also interesting to see how when the reference became so sunken into the architect, the drawing almost becomes the same, although in reality it's just about a certain coherence of design, although in reality the project that result from these two references, or the projects in the case of Sakamoto, are quite distinguishable from each other, but when we look at the drawings together, they seem almost the same. It was also important to understand that we brought references not just as graphical elements, but also as projects. And in this case, this was a project that I would call it the the heat of the year. So this was the project that had the biggest impact on the class. So the Kamiwada House by Toyo Ito, and we presented it, we explained it, and then we spent weeks and months explaining how to put a column in a square. Is it one column in the case of Danielle? Is it 4 columns in the case of João? Or is it 3 columns that are off-centered on a circle near a curve from Guilherme? And it was very interesting to see how this idea of the square and the column, and how the relation between the, let's call it, geometrical principles of the plan, the structural principles of the column, somehow detached from one another, as if these systems were trying to be separate from each other, or if they were just a rhetorical construction, going again to Shinohara, this idea that he was doing already in the 60s, these square houses with a central column that was never central, that was never a column. So it was very interesting to see how students that, so motivated by the exercise, forgot about what we were trying to do. They were just producing brutal content. That was fascinating. And talking about columns is talking about form. And we are taught in school that columns are square, columns are round. What if they are neither? So what if the column itself becomes for a week a project, designing the best possible column? And you can see on the plan below that the column itself has rules, compositions, proportions, and you can produce very different things from this. Or you can just take the traditional column and make it non-traditional. So in this case, Joanna takes the very, very, very common concrete column, and by slicing it and shifting it a few centimeters, she creates her column, a column that did not exist until the moment where she had this gesture. And we talked about systems, and we talked about systems that had relations with the facade, for example, on the left, where the facade system became, let's say, the engine of the expression of a certain space or a certain building. And we talked about plan systems, how a tower of 16 levels is designed in such a way that all the plans are exactly the same without being at all equal to each other. We talked about different ways of using the same tool. For example, again on the left, the axonometric construction of the spatial structure, and on the right side, the axonometric construction or comparison of the contrasting elements within a certain domestic space. And it was very funny to see how these were somehow contaminating each other. At some point, we were not talking about the reference anymore. These things, they just got appropriated and became valuable production tools. And the same axonometric can become illustrative also. And it can become illustrative on the right side to the literal extent of what a project is, the right textures, the right materiality, or to a certain degree of abstraction on the left, where certain walls, floors, and ceilings are removed, and just the exceptional elements show up. It could also be about perspective, and we forbid all our students to use Photoshop. Photoshop is, if not taught properly, a disease. Therefore, what if every time you have an idea and you want to test it and you want to see it and you want to do a perspective out of it, you just draw it? Like, you know, Caesar does with a pen, you do it with a mouse and AutoCAD. And it was very interesting again to see, for example, on the right side, the literal translation of the colors and materials, and on the left side, this more abstract construction where just the pattern of the stones on the floor and the exceptional elements pop out. And even the inside jokes, for example, in this case, Daniel managed to put the axonometric of his project in the perspective of his project. And to me, this kind of very, very, very tiny details, like cherries on top of chocolate cakes, are truly delicious to see. We talked about systematization, for example. The same plan can be seen and read in many different ways, and this is an example of that. Or the narrative, you know, where the plan tells you something about the rhetorics of the project, but the, let's say, the illustration of the actual space being used and being occupied, and, you know, in this case by an anonymous whose legs we see but we don't know nothing about, is completely different. And finally, construction. So for example, I take these 3 slides from the same project to express these 3 different angles. Rhetorics, one thing; narrative, another thing; tectonics, another thing. And they are seen together but also isolated. And then we design everything. We had students designing furniture, chairs, tables, designing handles. It was insane because at some point, well, to be completely honest, we lost control. It was just every week, every talk, every student was just surprising us on a weekly basis. And it was very funny to see again that the furniture they were designing with so much care found itself inside these perspectives themselves that had that column in the back, to the extent where they even designed the sculptures that would occupy their own projects. It was almost disturbing and fascinating. And of course, this became a celebration. This became a kind of scream for independence. It was a kind of political statement that architecture is fun. Architecture is actually an outstanding thing, and it should not be something we do from 9 to 5 for a salary. It's more than that. And in this case, this idea that architecture is the highest value, the project becomes the highest value, was perfectly illustrated in this presentation by Ricardo. And as I said before, we had the opportunity to teach in Zoom, which was not a bad thing at all, because we managed to invite guests that otherwise would not be possible to present the work, to talk with the students, you know, to give a one-to-one weekly discussion to second-year students with some of the best architects of next generation. And I would like to finish by presenting a quote from one of them that summarizes everything we did this year, which is a quote from Nuno Brandão Costa during the presentation to our students. Architecture is a wonderful thing. And with this, I would like to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No se puede aplaudir.
O sea,
Aplausos virtuales, tal cual.
muchas gracias por...
Muy motivante.
Sí, muy hermoso.
And now we have Daniel and Simão and Diana. I saw their names, so they are around. So any questions about the student part? I believe they will be amazingly, they will answer amazingly.
Yo no los veo, pero si quieren comentar algo, son bienvenidos.
Dani?
Mientras tanto voy buscando algunas de las preguntas que teníamos de chicos.
Creo que está hablando, pero no se escucha.
Is there anyone speaking?
Bueno, si no, preguntamos algunas cosas y si están teniendo problemas con el micrófono pueden escribir en el chat de última. Una de las preguntas que teníamos, que es de Matías Scaglione, que está por acá, que es un estudiante de Historia, un poco reformulada para hacerla un poco más breve, es cómo conciben los modos de habitar contemporáneos y si, digamos, ver si se articula de alguna manera eso con su manera de dibujar y de pensar la arquitectura a partir del dibujo. Y piensan que justamente ese proceso de proyecto puede dar lugar a nuevos modos de habitar más relacionados con la vida contemporánea. Algo así. Tanto para Felipe, para Fala, digamos, como para los estudiantes. ¿Cuál es su impresión? También comparando con referentes de la historia, a lo mejor con Palladio, como decías antes.
I think that the world has changed. It has changed many times. So it changed on the day that someone decided that they should build a house for the first time, on the day that they decided that that house should have different rooms, on the day that they decided that a bathroom should be something that is inside a house and not outside. That was 120 years ago. It was not that long ago. And it changed on the day that concrete was invented and applied to architecture. And I would say that the biggest change that happened in the last 20, 30 years was the invention of the internet. A great example of that is that we don't need architecture to have 135 people spread over the planet right now talking together. This changed mankind. The world changed. And it changed, and it's getting smaller and smaller, because today we have more technology in an object like an iPhone than we have in entire countries 50 years ago. There's more technology in the palm of my hand than, France had in the 1950s. So it is important to put that in perspective and to consider that if things change this fast and this dramatically, space probably also will change because the needs will change. So I would argue that the way how we draw and talk and think is a direct consequence of our education, of our references, of our time, of course. But the spaces we produce, they are a direct, let's say, a direct result from those discussions. So to a large extent, I believe we are just another contemporary practice. We are not trying to, let's say, we are not trying to invent a new, let's say, a new way of living, but by just belonging to our time and designing in our time and having clients of our time, we will naturally shift from whatever our teachers were doing 40 years ago to what we are doing today. And if you see a great example, that is Álvaro Siza, he is 86 now and is fresher than ever. And it's fascinating to see that he was doing a certain architecture in the 60s. He was from the 70s in the 70s. He was from the 80s in the 80s. He was from the 90s in the 90s. And today he's building in Argentina, he's building in Brazil, he's building in Korea, he's building in New York, he's building everywhere. And always with the same, you see, it's a Siza building all the time. It belongs to the time where it was built. So he's not doing this kind of abstract, weird thing that looks like, no, he's actually belonging to the place where he builds and to the time that he builds in. So I think that this is what we should aim for. Trying to just reinvent the wheel is not a goal at all.
Sí. Otra pregunta en relación, a estaba hecha, digamos, en relación a los collages, pero creo que se podría aplicar un poco a todos los aspectos de los que hablaste hoy. Martina Boggio pregunta, en sus representaciones muestran un espacio vívido y cotidiano. ¿Están imaginados en relación con un personaje en particular, con sus gustos, sus preferencias y sus rituales, o responden a una idea de sujeto universal?
The two of them. So in a way, they are universal. Like, we don't want to limit space, like, because we do not design lifestyles, we do not design outfits, we design space. So we create opportunities and we create flexibility. And flexibility is not because walls move. That's total bullshit. Flexibility is about creating a set of opportunities that then the users will use in different ways a long time. And that's what we do. But when we do an image, different people in the office do the collages, so everyone in the office does collages. So they do it in a different way. And I know by looking at a collage, just by looking at it, who did that one, because it has a bit of a personality thing. So yes, it's trying to be as universal as possible. But yes, it's completely personal in the sense that whoever does it creates his own version of what a universal occupation could be. So we want the collage to be to open the field and not to be a limitation in the way how the space is going to be, used.
Bien.
Can I just ask if Dani is already? Is your mic already working? Because he sent me a message.
No sé.
Sí.
Sí.
¿Qué tal?
Ok, perfecto. Bueno, yo voy a decir particularmente nuestra experiencia como estudiantes del segundo año, trabajando con un profesor como Felipe, que nos motivaba no solamente a hacer las clásicas cosas que nos piden arquitectura, sino también esos diseños un poco más experimentales, que también de cierta manera nos retan un poco a buscar cosas que nosotros mismos no sabemos que podemos utilizarlas dentro de la arquitectura. Por ejemplo, nosotros, claro, viniendo del primer año, para nosotros una columna de repente no tenía el mismo nivel de aprovechamiento que puede tener ahorita, hoy en día, una pared para separar dos espacios diferentes que, como dijo Felipe, son ideas que van saliendo desde que el proyecto nace, son ideas muy fuertes que de cierta manera las ves ya cuando estás organizando la planta, cuando estás organizando el espacio. Pero esa manera de irlas representando y que esas ideas mismas vayan pasando por un proceso, diferentes representaciones, diferentes prácticas, diferentes maneras de verlas o de hacerlas, diferentes materialidades también. Al final del día terminas abriendo mucho más no solamente la experiencia que querías dar a ese espacio, sino también la experiencia de qué es lo que ese espacio va a representar para las personas que ocupen ese espacio, las personas que lo usen. Y la verdad también me parece muy importante esto que Felipe también comentó, que ellos hacen muchas pruebas de las diferentes, por ejemplo, una fachada, muchísimas pruebas de la misma fachada. También eso es algo que nosotros, ¿sabes? Al comienzo no teníamos tanta sensibilidad, teníamos una idea en la cabeza y queríamos trabajar y forzar esa idea porque sentíamos que eso era lo que estábamos haciendo bien. Cuando realmente, cuando tú vas probando diferentes opciones, diferentes maneras de hacer las cosas, te das cuenta de que en el mismo proyecto que ya tienes estancado 2 semanas o algo así, tienes una solución al frente que, bueno, de cierta manera uno lo dice fácil, pero en el momento, claro, uno sufre y puede pasar muchísimo tiempo intentando solucionarlo así. La verdad es que esta combinación de, por decirlo así, de unos estudiantes ingenuos, o sea, de segundo año, todavía no saben muy bien cómo es que esto de la arquitectura se maneja, pero al mismo tiempo con un profesor como Felipe, que nos estaba mostrando unas técnicas completamente inusuales, pero que nos abrían mucho más la cabeza, dio como resultado lo que fue Turma Mais Fish, que la verdad fue una experiencia tanto virtual como presencialmente muy buena para todos. La verdad es que todos nuestros alumnos salieron bien satisfechos con la experiencia del año. Y bueno.
Les pregunto si, por ejemplo, cuando en los ejercicios les ponen el tema de la proporción, o cuando ejercitan sobre un elemento, la columna, y las posibilidades que eso tienen, ¿los ayudó a ustedes como estudiantes a ir a ir dimensionando estos elementos relevantes o temas que son importantes para la arquitectura? ¿A ustedes como estudiantes poner una escala en eso?
La verdad no solamente nos ayudó, sino creo que fue la base para todo el trabajo que seguimos produciendo durante todo el año, porque también esos son temas más específicos que de repente a veces no son tratados con tanta importancia, pero al final del día es ahí donde nosotros tenemos que buscar los puntos fuertes de nuestros proyectos, es ahí donde nosotros tenemos que sacar lo que va a diferenciar nuestros proyectos de lo otro. Y por lo menos en nuestro caso, que ok, no estábamos trabajando para un cliente, estábamos trabajando para nosotros mismos como clientes, pero teníamos esa posibilidad de ir viendo lo que nuestros compañeros iban haciendo, cómo ellos utilizaban esos mismos elementos para sacar el máximo provecho de ese espacio, del mismo elemento, del proyecto completo. La verdad es que no solo nos ayudó, sino que fueron las bases para todo lo que fue el resto del trabajo, en mi opinión.
And one thing that is very important that I did not explain was, or maybe Dani, you can explain better, the switching of projects. This was also very important.
Ok, sí, nosotros también trabajamos con diferentes grupos, o sea, los grupos de trabajo durante el semestre los íbamos cambiando y también el proyecto en el que trabajamos lo íbamos cambiando. Nosotros siempre trabajamos en pares o casos específicos de tríos, pero al comienzo cada uno tenía una idea diferente y lo iba discutiendo con su pareja, con su equipo, y claro, la idea poco a poco iba tomando una dirección un poco más diferenciada de lo que como comenzó. De repente hubo aspectos más de mi compañero que con los míos, cuando al comienzo el proyecto era mío realmente, pero esto también nos llevó de cierta manera a tener esa capacidad, esa flexibilidad mental de no estar solamente trabajando con un trabajo durante todo el semestre, sino también ir cambiando proyectos diferentes, espacios diferentes, compañeros diferentes. También creo que fue una de las partes más importantes de este proceso. Y este trabajo de cambiar los proyectos es muy poco inusual, me parece a mí, por lo menos para nosotros, fue la primera vez que lo hacíamos, pero resultó perfecto porque de cierta manera cuando uno volvía al proyecto que estaba trabajando antes, tu cabeza estaba abierta, tu cabeza estaba más tranquila, más relajada, ya tenía otras ideas, porque en el otro proyecto pudiste sacar provecho de ciertas cosas que ya las veías en tu proyecto. Y eso también fue una actividad, la verdad, muy interesante este año para trabajar un poco eso, cómo nosotros como estudiantes y como futuros arquitectos tenemos la capacidad no solamente de estar centrados en un tema específico, sino también ir buscando y experimentando cosas en otros lugares que al final del día nos ayudaron a llegar a nuestra solución final.
One of the things, just to add on what Danny said, was that in the beginning, so the first semester, each student did a project, done. And it was the beginning, so we need to get to know the students. It was in-depth development of a single family house. On the second semester, they worked in a pair for a week, and then they switched. A new pair another week, and they switch, and a new pair another week, and they switch. So after 3 weeks, each of them had worked with 3 different people, each of them with different personalities and ambitions, always on the same site with the same program. But they already did 3 projects. So on the 4th week, they start working with a final pair, and they work for 2 weeks, and when they get really comfortable because they find out this is our project, we switch the project. So the project cannot change anymore, but it's going to go for someone else to work it. And of course, people get very upset because they love their project so much. Some people get relieved because they didn't like their project that much. And then it moves to the next person, and when it moves to the next person, they work on it. And then after they do some development, we take them back to the original owner, and we did this every 2 weeks. And in the end, the last month, each student had to work individually on a part of the project. So of course, each student worked on a part of the project of someone else. So in the end, what happens is that what we could call Dani project start with Dani, went to Simão, moved to Alexandre, then was destroyed by the vid, that came back again to Mariana and ended up being developed in detail by João. So there's no ownership, there's no authorship. And the final result, so like the drawings I showed today on the PDF, they had a name, and they had the name of the last person who drew that drawing. But each of those drawings has so many people already contributing to them that the whole idea of having an author is a lie. The drawing itself has an author. The project has an architecture experience. Forget about it. It's impossible to know where every single line, every single column, every single intention came from. And we believe this was very important for 2 main reasons. Reason number 1, it's not fair, it's not okay for a student to work 6 months in the same plan. It's not okay, mostly in the second year. In the second year, you need to run the marathon every week. You need to see new things, you need to do new things, you need to get new references. And the second reason was that we don't want to create a rhythm in the classroom where one student wants to be the best. I have the best project, I have the best grade, everyone else is worse than I am, and then it also creates the student and thinks he's the worst. So we tried as much as possible to do what we do in the office, to flatten the surface. So if an idea is good, it doesn't matter if it comes from, you know, Palladio or from an anonymous building on the street. If there's an amazing reference, you use the reference. And because, and this is the crucial part of the success of the thing, these are second-year students. They don't know the Malaparte house. They don't know what it is. They don't know, you know, anything about, I don't know, any architect from the US. So this means everything that is given is new, it's fresh, and it's at the same level. So because for us, it's very easy to say that Palladio is a monster, is a sacred name. But if you don't know who Palladio is, and you don't like it, then it's not a sacred name, and you use, you know, some nasty architect that is just much more interesting to you. So this was very interesting, this flattening of the levels, let's say, between reference hierarchy, student hierarchy, project authorship. Everything was completely horizontal. And the final results, as I said, we just lost control, and the process, let's say the system of production, took over. And at some point, we just had the classes just to say, okay, continue, please proceed. We are not doing anything anymore. And it was very, very, very intriguing to see how such a stupid idea ended up working so well. Because in the beginning, we were very skeptical. We switched once just to see, does this work? But it was so good, we said, let's switch it again. Because we just wanted to switch once. But then we switched it like 6-7 times in the end. And it was the best idea. Now this year, we're going to teach second year again, and we're going to switch more often even. It's going to be more repetitive.
Acá esa idea de intercambiar proyectos, en una de las cátedras de nuestra universidad, Cátedra Royce, se aplicó hace algunos años. Hay varios estudiantes de Cátedra Royce. Si alguno vivió esa experiencia, estaría bueno que cuente cómo le resultó también. la dejo picando por si alguien aparece, estoy viendo algunos nombres, pero no sé bien quiénes llegaron a agarrar esa modificación de ir intercambiando proyectos. Y quería, mientras tanto, preguntarles, en todos estos proyectos que desarrollan dentro de la materia, ¿llegan a ese nivel de detalle que se ve en el Instagram, por lo menos de resolver, no de resolver, sino de pensar el picaporte, el alféizar de la ventana, la puerta? En todos los proyectos se llega a ese detalle, a esa escala.
It was about defining the rhythm. So there was a week. So on the first day of class, the first day, I asked each student to take an A4 sheet and to design a square. And then I asked them to divide the square in two parts, not equal parts. And everyone drew a line in the middle. And then as you push and poke and poke and poke, they started creating different ways of dividing a square. And what started by being the hardest task in the world, in how many ways can you divide a square in two, taught the students what a diagram is. So there's the black side of the square, there's the white side, and there's many ways how you can do that. And when we did this on the beginning, this was about providing direct content. This is how a diagram is taught. So without using the word diagram, you teach what a diagram is. But when we were on the second semester, so after already knowing the students, after the rhythm is in place, what we decided to do was, because the students were working so much and the results were working as we wished for, okay, this week everyone has to do an elevation. But one elevation is not one drawing. One elevation is a full study on how to draw an elevation, and we would give the graphical references and say, you draw an elevation like this, you draw like this, you draw like that. And then on the next week, switch. And then this week you need to draw a plan. So you're drawing a plan for an elevation that you didn't have before. And then on the next week, now you need to draw a room and to look at the room per se. And now you need to go inside and you need to draw a bathroom. And now you need to draw a piece of cabinetry. And now you need to draw the handle. And in the end, what happened is that when they were drawing the handle, they were discovering something, going back to the plan, changing the elevation, going back to the room. And then because they touched in 8 projects, they were calling the other students saying, on your project that I touched 3 weeks ago, you need to change this on the living room. You need to put this there because this. And at some point, there are some expressions we created, like the column from Danielle, the window from Joanna, the this from that. So because they were the ones who came up with that crazy idea, but in the end, it's not on their project. So Danielle's project has the window from Cecilia, and Cecilia's project has the column from Carla, and etc., etc., etc. It was very, very, very much horizontal, but because we forced, let's say, a certain rhythm in terms of production, and because everyone assumed that was normal, because they worked a lot. They worked more than my diploma students the year before. So because they thought this was normal, they kept going and going and going and going and going. And in the end, the PDF presentations of all the projects were just insane construction. Everyone had drawn, I don't know, they don't know how to build. So many mistakes in terms of construction, even in terms of gravity. But that's not the point. They are second-year students. They are not meant to know how to build. They are meant to know, they are meant to be motivated and to want to build. That's the goal. And they had that way too much. So it was really, really funny to see how, if you don't know how a door works, but you have the ambition to design a door handle, what kind of door do you design? And this was really, really rich.
Hello, Felipe. I have one question for you. For example, in the Grasa apartment, what came first? The doors that are likely like paintings, or I mean, a ver, lo digo en español, porque hace un montón que no hablo inglés.
Por supuesto.
Ustedes usan los dibujos como una cuestión diagramática, en algunos casos. Es decir, las puertas se les ocurrieron hacerlas tipo cuadro y después lo representaron, o fue algo que apareció en el dibujo como una idea que le sacaron provecho.
The drawing shows up in the project and the collage shows up in the project. So let's say in the creative phase, everything is kind of mixed. So I don't remember if it was the elevation first or the collage first. But in that case, it was very simple. So we have an apartment that has a lot of secondary rooms behind the wall. Bedrooms, bathrooms, entrance hall, etc. And all of them, they need sewage pipes passing under. So the only way for us to do it was to lift the ground of those. we could also go to the living room and lift the ground of the living room, and then everything was going to be horizontal. The doors would be touching the floor, and therefore they would be in the middle of the wall. But because the space was so small, this is a very small apartment you're talking about, so we decided to not do that on the living room. So we're going to keep all the floor height, and we're going to create a step every time you go inside a secondary space. But if you have a wall like this and all the doors are 20 centimeters higher, you have these holes. So the doors stop being doors and they become holes on the wall. So we decided, what if we move the door out? So what if we do the detail of the door so that the door is actually outside of the wall? It's floating in front of the wall. And once we did that detail, we started doing the same tests that Daniel and the students did last year, how to draw a handle for this door, how to draw a hinge, how to draw the door itself. And we concluded that the best way was to treat them as canvases. And we used these plywood panels. They are very, very cheap because there was also low budget at stake. And we painted the two surfaces in a strong color, and we just kept the wood on the sides, and we put them on the wall. So when you look at them on the apartment, they really feel like floating monochromes, you know, this kind of cheap Mark Rothko testing canvases. And it was very interesting for us to see that an idea, this was one of our first build projects. So something that was very, 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 very schematically thought, in the end resulted exactly as we imagined conceptually. They are floating canvases, not doors. And of course, in this case, we used a very small handle, we used invisible hinges. We did a lot of things in order for that to work. But it came, I don't know, it came out of technical need. If we did not have that technical need for a step, we would not do those steps. But from the moment we had to do those steps, we had to celebrate them somehow, and we celebrated them by making the doors very important.
Le quería preguntar a los estudiantes si, por ejemplo, cuando van avanzando en el ejercicio, si lo comprendí bien, cuando van centrándose en algún tema, no sé, o diseñan un mueble, o van cambiando como de escala de reflexión, ¿no? sobre el diseño y sobre hacer pruebas. Por ejemplo, cuando trabajan sobre la planta y hacen como ensayos, ¿van articulando criterios? ¿Cómo van estableciendo los criterios para las variaciones? Es parte de cuando se pusieron a hacer, por ejemplo, el ejercicio que mostraron de la planta. Van articulando, digamos, no sé, si ponen un plano recto, un plano curvo, un plano que es cóncavo y convexo dentro de un espacio cuadrado, ¿van haciendo variaciones en ese modo?
Bueno, la verdad es que sí. Hacemos muchas variaciones, pero todas ellas surgen de la necesidad que nosotros tenemos. Porque, por ejemplo, no sé, me pasó a mí personalmente, una solución muy buena que tenía para un problema era una pared curva, pero después esa pared iba a ser una cocina. Claro que una cocina no puede ser curva, uno también tiene que, de cierta manera, tener cierto cuidado con esos detalles, quizás. Pero a la hora de nosotros buscar la solución, la verdad, esos puntos que eran más importantes eran como los puntos que rompían las reglas que nosotros teníamos, por decirlo así. En una planta siempre tenemos una métrica, que después la métrica lleva a las columnas, donde va a estar localizada cada una, pero si por alguna razón nosotros no queremos que, no sé, necesitamos un espacio dividido en dos, ya comenzamos, ok, vamos a poner una línea recta, o una línea curva, o una línea como una escalera. Yo creo que eso ya depende más de la necesidad de cada uno realmente y lo que estemos buscando de hacer. Y después, cuando estamos trabajando a una escala de planta, una escala más grande, por decirlo así, claro que la solución tiene que ser probada de diferentes maneras, no solamente, bueno, una pared curvilla, no, claro, cómo quedaría la curva, cómo quedaría la recta, todo. Pero a mí me parece que después, cuando uno llega cuando uno aumenta la escala y trabaja más al detalle, siempre van saliendo cosas que de repente no dejan que esa idea funcione tan bien y entonces tienes que volver otra vez a la escala de la planta. Por eso, la verdad, para nosotros fue un trabajo siempre de las dos escalas al mismo tiempo, sabiendo que, ok, en nuestra planta tenemos una métrica que nosotros queremos tener ciertas excepciones para quebrarlas de cierta manera. pero también tenemos que asegurarnos que eso funcione a una escala mucho más aproximada. Entonces, sí, la respuesta es que nosotros tenemos que buscar cómo quebrar las reglas que nosotros mismos hicimos de cierta manera que terminen favoreciendo nuestro proyecto y nuestra idea.
En cada cambio de proyecto, ¿qué hacían? Digamos, una vez que recibían un proyecto de otro, cuando ustedes recibían el proyecto de otro compañero, sobre ese trabajo, ¿establecían una transgresión, hacían unas alteraciones o tenían una consigna nueva a la que responder?
También dependía mucho del momento en el que nosotros hicimos el cambio, porque claro que había momentos en el que cuando hacíamos el trabajo ya teníamos cierta libertad, ya podíamos dejar un poco más nuestro gusto, por decirlo así, pero por lo menos hubo un momento que fue el crucial, por decirlo así, en nuestro proyecto, que fue, nosotros estábamos trabajando en grupos, en parejas, cada pareja tenía una residencia hecha, porque ese era el proyecto de este semestre, una residencia de estudiantes. Y ya cuando era la parte de pasar al detalle de aumentar la escala, volvimos otra vez a cambiar de proyectos y ya estamos trabajando individualmente, cada uno en una residencia que era de otra persona. Y por lo menos en ese caso, claro que no podíamos, habían ciertas cosas que no podíamos cambiar, ¿sabes? Habían cosas que tenían que mantener así y eran así, pero claro, siempre queríamos dejar nuestra marca, por decirlo así, en los proyectos. Entonces ahí pasamos de repente a que los cambios que hacíamos ya no eran una escala 1:100, sino que eran una escala 1:20, ya cambiaba más, era la manera como las ventanas se abrían de repente, las puertas también donde estaban hechas. Pero la verdad es que en las experiencias que nosotros tuvimos cambiando el proyecto en una fase más inicial, hubo de todo. Hubo personas que cambiaron el proyecto bruscamente, que parecía uno nuevo, de repente otro ya continuaba la idea y lo que hacía era proporcionar más ideas que simplemente lo dejaran fluir. Y la verdad es que también depende mucho de la personalidad de cada uno, en mi parecer, y también del proyecto que uno tenga al frente realmente, porque si tú tienes un proyecto que ves que funciona bien, ves que está todo bien resuelto dentro de lo posible, vas a buscar hacer ese proyecto todavía mejor, ¿sabes? Tampoco vas a querer echar el proyecto un poco para atrás porque después tú mismo estábamos otra vez en una fase que ya deberíamos haberla pasado, por decirlo así. No sé si te aclaré la pregunta.
But there's just one very, very tiny thing I have to say, that one of the questions we ask the most to the students, so we, the teachers, and I was teaching with João Carlos, we didn't say his name yet, and we should. João Carlos was teaching with me the whole time, was why? We would not say no or yes, we would just ask why. So if someone shows up with the weirdest, craziest idea, we would ask, are you sure? Why? And depending on the answer, what we would comment or criticize would be the answer, not the project. The project is the proposal, and we as the teachers have the role to make the student understand on his own, does that really make sense? Is that the best solution? Is that the most obvious answer? And what happened is that we had two kinds of responses. Sometimes was well, because it makes sense and this is how it should be. And in that case, we would, emphasize it. Okay, then go forward. This is your idea. I don't care about it. Just move on, but make sure to make it work. And then the comments we do are in order to make this idea work better. If the student would be, I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm not thinking about it. Okay, then take it down and start something else. And this way, and they're like, yeah, but I already liked it. So, but you just said you don't like. But do you like it or you don't like it? So I need to understand. I don't know. If you don't know, I don't know also. So, and the whole point is not for us to provide answers, but to provide the tools that then can allow the students to reach the answers. And what was really interesting was when we did the last switch and they had to work on the individuals' projects, we asked the people who did the group work, the final stage of the group work, to behave as clients. So if they wanted to change a wall or to demolish a column or to change the facade, for a couple of weeks, they had to talk with them. And then we just said in the end, don't worry about it. From now on, you do whatever you want. But for 2 weeks, in order to do a drastic change in the project, and there were drastic changes, you need to convince them. If they don't give you permission, you can't. And what was interesting is that because everyone was to a certain extent detached from the project, no one owned the projects, everyone was able to discuss at the same level and say, yes, that actually makes sense. Let's do it like this. Or even better, if you're going to do this, also demolish this or that because it can get even better and so on. So it stopped being about, I defend my project, you cannot criticize my project, and it became more about what is the best idea for this project to work. And it was really interesting to see the good relation between the students in that sense. Like there were discussions, of course, there was of course friction, but that's part and that's necessary. But the final result was the absolute lack of ownership and this horizontal quality that I think that all the projects were between 90 and 100%. All of them were at that very high level. It's almost impossible to have the best project and the worst project. We can detach, and this might seem unfair. There are some students that work a bit more. There are some students that are, you can create a ranking, let's say. It's possible to do that. But when you look at the projects, and when you ask anyone, what's the best project on the class, no one knows. It's completely impossible to define who did the best project and the worst project. It's not there. You don't see it anymore.
En el modo, por lo menos que las cosas que mostraste de los ejercicios y lo que ellos relatan es súper interesante cómo van avanzando en una reflexión o sobre el rol de un elemento de arquitectura, sobre lo general, o sea, como estrategia para que ellos lo vayan haciendo y van profundizando en eso con un nivel súper fuerte, que un estudiante de segundo año vaya ensayando eso, o sea, el impacto de cómo dos formas en el espacio generan algo, y lo van haciendo, está muy buena la mecánica, me parece, porque alcanzan, ¿no? Y pueden reflexionar sobre estos temas de arquitectura, sobre elementos, y eso vuelve la discusión, los obliga a ellos a tener más argumentos que los puedan transmitir, entonces vuelve una discusión más interesante sobre cómo uno piensa arquitectura. Parece que el ejercicio está bueno en eso.
But it's also important to say that there's a preconceived idea of what a second year student is. And maybe because we are not used to teach second year, or maybe because we are used to work in a certain way in the office, what we did was that we didn't treat them as second year students. We demanded and we requested and we pushed for the students to do what we do in the office. And of course, in the first semester, there's an adaptation period. But I can say without any doubt that although they are second year students, in the second semester, they produced at the same pace of the architects that work with us in the office. People that have 5-6 years of experience post-diploma produce at the same pace as they do. Of course, the maturity is different and the accuracy is different. But in terms of capacity to discuss, it was insane. That's why I'm now very, very curious to see what is going to happen next year, because I'm not going to keep this class, so I'm going to have new students, and they will have new teachers. And I'm very curious to see if the new teachers are going to praise this or just kind of, panic because they got our students. I'm very curious to see how they fit into society now. Let's see.
Yeah.
Simão, estás aí?
So,
Ah.
a very important thing that hasn't been spoken is group mentality that was developed amongst the class. That was a thing that made the exchange so successful, because I didn't really care about my project being the best. We all had the preoccupation of the class being the best. And we had like a fight between the other class. And I think this is the thing that everyone takes from this year of classes, is that a group is much stronger and you can have much better results when you work together and within students than when you are like by yourself, focused on your project because you want to be the best. That won't I think the thing that what we understood this year is that isn't the way to make someone successful. That's all.
Simão also has blood from South America, and I was truly expecting he was going to speak in Spanish, and he shows up in English. Now I'm disappointed.
No, my father works in Colombia. He's a civil engineer. He's working nearby Medellin.
Tenés que hablar más español.
Sorry.
Hablo muito.
I was going to ask Felipe if you are panicking over what is going to happen next year. Is that because there's a clear line in the university that you are breaking, or is it a more diverse environment
I hope so.
regarding ideas or professors or whatever?
I mean, I hope so, but it's not about, so let's be very clear. I come from a very, very good school. The Porto school is a very good school in our context, but it's a terrible school in the international context. You know, if you look at ETH in Zurich, at Harvard in the US, you know, those are really good schools. Porto school is very good in Portugal, but it's not very good in this league. So it's like that club that is very good in your city but does not play on the national league, and the best club from your national league does not play against Real Madrid or Barcelona. You see, there's a ranking. And ISCTE, so the university where we are teaching, is not even the best school in Lisbon. It's not an outstanding school, but it is a school that has the outstanding capacity to be able to recognize that, to understand that they are not there yet. And in the last couple of years, and this year again, they invited, I know the new teachers that will start next year, they opened the borders and they said, if we do not have the tradition and the history and the big names that those other schools have, we need to be experimental to a certain extent. And what they allowed us to do in Portugal, keep in mind, we're talking about one of the most conservative countries in Europe, you know, a country that is still in many aspects in the 70s. If they give us the permission to do whatever we wanted, and the students they are here, they can tell it, it's completely like out of the box. We could do anything we wanted to, they would allow us. They would not put any obstacle on the way. And quite the opposite, the administration were the first ones after the first exercise to renovate our contract. Like, we need more of this. We don't know what this is. We don't know what result this is going to produce, but this is the kind of mindset we want. And so in that sense, and keep in mind that ISCTE is a small school in the country, I can only wish that if in a small school with small resources and not in a very good tradition, we can produce good results, this proves several things. Architecture is not genetic. It's not because you are in a good school that you become a good architect. And it's not about the teachers and it's not about the students, it's about a lot of things. But if the mindset is the main quality that this school has, you know, the capacity to reinvent itself, I mean, let's make the most out of it. Let's really try to push for that, because we will not have the great teachers from Zurich coming to Portugal. That will never happen. But we can have, you know, enough energy and passion and reinvention that somehow compensates for that difference of level. So yes, I hope this is just the first step of many steps in the direction of change of path. But a dramatic one, not just shifting a bit. We really want to, and we pushed a lot for that. Like, we devoted a lot of hours to teaching, much more than what the contract demanded, but much more, like 2 to 3 times more. We talked with the students on the weekends, we talked to students in the evenings. I mean, we devoted all the time we had to devote for it to work out, which is something that the vast majorities of the teacher in our country would not do. If possible, they do less than what they have to. So I think this new generation needs to take over one way or another. And we are part of that generation. We are actually the youngest of a new generation. And it's important that this kind of political revolution happens, because otherwise we have the same teachers until they are 85 and literally they die teaching. It's not fair. We have teachers that don't even know how to turn on a computer in a time where, you know, the digital exists. We have teachers that don't know a single name of a foreign architect outside of Portugal. I mean, this is not fair for the students. And this does not mean that what we did is amazing. It just means that we need diversity. We need to have different people teaching different things and creating critical thinkers that will then be able to decide how they want to become practitioners of the discipline. If we just give the right answer according to some, we're going to end up creating an army of zombies. And this is really sad, very, very sad.
I think most of us in Rosario can agree with that thinking.
I have no idea what is going on in Rosario. This is nothing at all about Rosario. I don't know.
No, it is a bit, in a way.
It's not just Rosario. It's not just Porto. It's a bit everywhere, except for the truly amazing schools. You know, everywhere we go and we give a lecture and we meet the teachers, we meet the students, we get a more or less common criticism. I think it's also a generational thing, because today information gets to everyone. 50 years ago, if you study in Porto, whatever you learn is your universe, because you don't know anything abroad. Today, you get more information from the Subtilitas blog or a Fazia blog spot or, unfortunately, Arch Daily than you get from anywhere else in the 50s. You can get in 10 minutes more information today than in a year 50 years ago. So it's a matter of time until this generation that understands that information is accessible, that have the curiosity. Curiosity is added value. Being curious enough to ask the right questions, it's a fundamental act for evolution. And I think that it's a matter of time until a generation that has a few satellite offices everywhere. If you talk about Spain, you need to talk about Mayo. If you talk about, I don't know, about France, you talk about Bruder. If you talk about Belgium, you talk about Untitled and KGDVS, and so on and so forth. You go to America, you have MOS, you have, I don't know, you have Tatiana Bilbao, you have Frida Escobedo, you have a new generation of people that are taking over. But unfortunately, they have to fight very steady institutions. So this takes time. This will take, it's not next year. It's going to be, I'm going to be old, and there's going to be already a new generation trying to take us down when it finally is in place. But it's fundamental that we have the energy to try it.
Y en cuanto a la enseñanza, por ejemplo, de la historia de la arquitectura, sí, de la historia de la arquitectura, sino algunos temas de arquitectura en la historia, ¿eso a ustedes les sirvió para su práctica, para posicionarse respecto a algunos temas? ¿Cómo fue?
I was going to speak in Spanish. Sorry. We like to define ourselves as apolitical, but apolitical in the sense that we don't want to be contaminated by any political direction or affiliation. We want to think by our own head. So it's not a kind of anarchist statement. It's just a critical thinker statement. So I believe it's possible to have a very left-wing approach to a certain topic and a very right-wing approach to another topic. I don't think it's either or. In the last 5 years, political correctness took over, and you cannot have an opinion anymore. We have the biggest amount of freedom speech ever, and everything we say offends everyone on social media. It's just insane. And everything today is about, gender equality, Black Lives Matter. There's too much confusion, too much noise. And we don't have a proper platform to just position ourselves as a unique voice that might be similar to other voices, but you don't have that opportunity anymore. Either you say the right thing or you're wrong. And therefore, extreme right-wing grows fast. But I think that, to a large extent, we respect names, and more important, we respect the buildings of certain names because we feel an affiliation to them. You spotted, for example, Shinohara. Shinohara is a name we look up to a lot. Alvaro Siza, the same. Peter Märkling in Switzerland, the same. And a lot of other architects, but just to pick a few. And more than looking at it from an historical perspective, we like to do depiction exercises on their buildings. Like very often, like this year that starts now, we are also going to teach in Toronto. And we're going to, you see, Zoom opens these doors. And we're going to be teaching just about houses from Japan in the 70s. Very specific period. Single family houses, but not the ones from Shinohara or Toyo Ito, the ones that everyone knows. We're going to talk about the ones, and we're going to study stuff we don't know, we never saw, about the other names, the guys in the back, the other guys that were producing, and we're going to depict them and try to build a catalog of these houses, because we think that a lot of people speak about Shinohara because they don't know the rest. So in that sense, we are very interested in history, the B side of history, the names that were also there, that were part of the party, but were never discussed, never brought abroad. But the specific episodes of history we are interested in, those are the ones whose architecture we relate to. So we have, I talked about Palladio, but we have very little interest in Palladio, to be honest. We could talk about, anything prior 1926, anything before the Khrushchev Villa, we don't care about. We don't care that much about. That does not mean we are not informed or aware. It's just like we feel that it's not the right reference. And the names we look up to, if you talk about Rem Koolhaas, you know that Rem Koolhaas already digested Corbusier, that digested Firenze, that digested, Palladio. You get Palladio you get your vitamins via new ingredients, not necessarily from the source. And if this, sorry, just to insist on one more aspect, and if you truly remove the political side, so if you really just look at the objects for the value they have or not, if you're truly ingenuous or naive to that extent, it happens what happened with these students, because they really don't know these things. They really have no idea about most of the names we talked about, but they managed to produce and to think and to reproduce, to impersonate them. That's the goal. So if you understand the meta level of their production without needing to respect their political opinions, you can extract from them only the stuff that is truly valuable. And they did it very well. Some of the architects we presented, for example, I showed a drawing from Kitagawara, one drawing. That's everything we showed from that architect. I can assure you that drawing alone had more of an impact on the whole class than, you know, all the buildings that Oscar Niemeyer built in his whole life. We did not discuss Niemeyer a single time, and we had a Brazilian student, and we discussed that drawing from Kitagawara weekly. So it's not about high or low, because we know Niemeyer is more important than that drawing, but if you don't talk about it, it does not exist. That's the point.
En ese sentido yo quería, digamos, me parece muy interesante la relación, digamos, que siempre de alguna manera están girando en torno a la idea de collage. Ustedes dicen que, bueno, en realidad en una charla tuya puntualmente me había gustado mucho escucharte decir que hay un punto en el que el collage se vuelve la manera de pensar arquitectura, digamos, y viceversa. Entonces, que al estar en un edificio que tienen que intervenir, empezar a ver los layers de revoque sobre ladrillo, por ejemplo, de un muro atrás de otro, desde ese lugar, desde el lugar que contabas hoy de pensar una fachada con una superposición de líneas, con cuadrados, con puntos, y armar composiciones, hasta, bueno, su manera de representar a partir del collage. Me parece increíble escuchar ahora que esta pedagogía, que es un poco un collage, o sea, esto de tomar de distintos lugares, de intercambiar los proyectos también, y de pensar de una manera por partes un proyecto y cómo eso va transformando lo anterior y lo siguiente. Digamos, me intriga saber si es algo decidido a conciencia, decir, bueno, cómo trasladamos nuestra manera de pensar y de hacer arquitectura a una pedagogía y a un programa de una materia de estudio, o se dio.
I think it's very easy to say a lot of things now because the final result of this academic year worked. You know, because usually success disguises the weaknesses. So if you win, if your team wins, you celebrate. It doesn't matter if they play well or not, you just celebrate. But in this case, and of course without the necessary critical distance and time to be fair, I think that what we did with the students is what we do in the office. For example, once in a while, or to give you a precise example, a couple of weeks ago, Ahmed bought on Amazon a series of 70s magazines from Japan because of this exercise we're going to do and so on. And in the middle, there's one from an architect we know very well called Itsuko Asegawa, and that's like the first monography she had. And there's a lot of projects, but all projects we know, but a lot of drawings and documents we have never seen. And Itsuko Asegawa, in the 1980s, mid-80s, when the computer was just starting, and they did not have the print screen button, so they could not do print screens, she would do a 3D model on a very basic 3D software, and then put an analog camera, because there were no digital cameras, in front of the screen, doing a long exposure photo, so that then she could have an image to show of the 3D model in a slideshow, or in a lecture, or in a book. And there's a huge collection of this on that magazine, and we were fascinated because we knew Shinohara did those in the early 90s. So we found out that 5 years before, a disciple of Shinohara was already doing that. So we can now speculate that probably Shinohara was actually impersonating the technique from Itsuko, but we don't know that yet. We're going to study that, but we don't know it yet. And what was very interesting for us was when we understood the simplicity of means and the difficulty that it was to do a simple print screen at a time, we decided to ask ourselves, why were they doing this? And we read a text. And after we read the text, we understood the motivation. And for the last, 10 days, we have just been doing that. We have just been doing wireframe 3D models and trying to look at them from angles that no one ever will. We went sick on this kind of idea. And we did it just because by accident we spotted that that architect did it for a certain reason and there was a text illustrating it. So this to say, this is just an example of everything we do it out of motivation, but a motivation can be a deep respect for the architecture of Alvaro Siza, for example, but also a quick input of a specific image of a specific project of a magazine. And sometimes we discover things that we thought that we always wanted, and other times there are things we say, oh, I'm not, for example, I spent almost a decade since I started architecture school saying I don't like Mies van der Rohe, because I felt Mies van der Rohe to be a very dry architect. And then only when I found out that he was actually doing fake columns everywhere, I fell in love with Mies. You know, all the columns we see are fake, the real ones are all hidden. And that made me fall in love with the organic side of Mies, because there's a very deep organic side in Mies. And it was very interesting to see that maybe I don't like what everyone likes about it, I actually hate it, but I really like the stuff that no one knows or cares or talks about it. And I think that's one of the things we should do as critical thinkers. We should look at the object and not just take it for granted because someone told us you have to. You just kind of depict it. And I remember having an history teacher that told me, you cannot not appreciate Mies van der Rohe. Like, that's forbidden. And it's with great pleasure today that I tell him I still don't. So it's perfectly possible. And I think, for example, we are doing a research project in Porto on our own in the office as a part of our PhD, where we are studying the anonymous buildings from the 60s and 70s in Porto. These are very nasty concrete buildings with tiled facades, you know, very badly designed, without architects, without engineers, just built directly by the construction companies. In the typical 5 meters wide plots in Porto. And what is interesting to see is that although these people, they did not know architecture, they did not know anything, they just built out of necessity and commercial purposes, they produced outstanding elevations, beautiful elevations. I don't know the plans, we don't have access, but we are studying the elevation compositions of these buildings. There are about 3,000 of them in Porto. We are photographing them. It's an insane, well, we are sick people, but it's really interesting to study them from the angle where these are not bad buildings anymore. These are just architectural examples, case studies, and they are so much better than most of the stuff you see on Architectura today. You know, the proud architects of today, they don't know how to design a facade. It's really sad. It's all about glass and nothingness. The detail is invisible. It's always about invisible detailing. And these guys, they just put tiles and strong colors and plants on the balconies and weird shutters and so on. And you look at those elevations and they are a celebration of what architecture should be. And this is another example. If these guys are not architects and are producing outstanding architecture, why can we not see it as such? Does it need to have a signature of an architect? I don't think so.
Tal cual. Hermoso. A ver, otra, hay una pregunta de Ignacio Pignani que decimos que es nuestro estudiante fanático de Sisa. Me va a matar por decir esto, pero bueno. Que pregunta, ¿cómo, bueno, ya hablaron bastante de Sisa, pero cómo se posicionan en relación a la denominada Escuela de Porto? Y de alguna manera, si ven, o qué aspectos ven de la cultura portuguesa reflejados en su propia obra, o si no es algo que les interese investigar, digamos.
We are a project, me and Anna. Ahmed comes from Zurich, but me and Anna, we were Porto students. Caesar is by far the most important architect alive. He's the most important architect post-Corbusier and post-Mies. And I say this as a personal opinion, of course, but I can stand and argue it. I can defend it. But as I said before, I don't think you make a nice meal if you only eat potatoes. I think potatoes are important, meat is important, tomatoes are important, and as architects, we should look a bit around. Even Caesar does that. If you see, for example, I don't know, let's pick a South American example, the Iberê Camargo Museum he built in Brazil. It is homage to Lina Bobardi, an homage to Niemeyer, an homage to Corbusier, an homage to Frank Lloyd Wright. It's all there. It's all there. But most important, it's a Caesar building. So that's what is truly fascinating. You don't need to look just at one name. And in Porto, we are taught to just look at CISA. CISA is the only answer. CISA is the solution to all our problems. And to a large extent, it's true. You can live all your life just with CISA. But if you bring a bit of Markley, if you bring a bit of Shinohara, just the same names I said before, your life is so much better. It's not against CISA. No, CISA is in the top. But if you take a few others that are in the top, not the boring ones, not the Rafael Moneo and cheaper fields of this life, because those are truly, truly sad architects. They are truly boring. They have one project thousands of times. CISA reinvents himself on every single project he does. And that's amazing. That's truly fantastic. So I can't criticize the school specifically, which has nothing to do with CISA, because the school lives on the shadow of CISA, because they want to be in his shadow, like he does not want that, but they still insist on that. But I can only praise CISA, but not just him. I can praise CISA and praise a few others besides him.
Y buscan, la otra pregunta era si de alguna manera les interesa como tema incorporar aspectos tradicionales de Portugal. Yo creo que hay, o sea, el uso de materiales, por ejemplo, muy portugués en un punto, pero les pregunto a ustedes, que es un poco la pregunta también que hacía Ignacio, digamos. Si hay, ¿qué aspectos de la cultura portuguesa pueden ver reflejados en su obra o deciden reflejar en su obra?
It's an interesting question because we are based in Portugal. At least two of us were educated in Portugal. We are Portuguese, and we build in Portugal for mostly Portuguese clients. So I think it's unavoidable that there's a Portuguese-ness to it. But I think the best answer is we are very comfortable in the place that we are put in by the guests we meet. In Portugal, our friends, colleagues, other architects say we are not Portuguese at all, that we are not doing Portuguese architecture. But when we go abroad, the guests of our presentation say, oh, it's so Portuguese what you do. So I think we like this. We like this limbo of being too Portuguese abroad, but not Portuguese enough in Portugal. That's where we feel comfortable.
Philip, acá tengo una pregunta de una docente que pregunta, ¿qué opinas en la enseñanza de la arquitectura, ¿no? Si es mejor enseñar, digamos, si pensás que es más valorable la enseñanza del diseño de un método para proyectar, o si eso más que el diseño de un proyecto. ¿Cómo lo ponderás desde la pedagogía?
I think they are both wrong to a certain extent, and I explain why. If you teach if you teach a student to design a specific project, is that metaphor. It's someone is hungry and you give them a fish. So you're not solving their problem because they're going to be hungry the next day, and there's going to be a new project with different conditions. If you teach them a method, it's like giving them a fish stick. So they can fish, but if they don't have a sea, there's no fish, so they don't do anything with it. I think you should teach every single student how to think on his own. And I know I'm repeating things I said before, in such a way that when the methodology changes, when the problem changes, when the project changes, he manages to be critical enough to adapt. So, for example, one of the things we ask our clients more often is, don't tell me what you want, tell me what you really don't want on a project, so that we understand what we cannot propose. Because every time you talk with a client, he only tells you, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and he never tells us, oh, I don't like curves. And in the first meeting, we show up with plans, with curves, and so on. It's a disaster. So now every time we have the first briefing and discussion, we just need to know very clearly what you will not accept. And many times we ask them, have you been to our website? And most of the times they have no idea of what we do. So they say no, and we say, so do the following. Now that we signed the contract, very important, go to our website and check what we built. And after, give us a feedback if there's something you like, you don't like. And most of the times they come back to us saying, no, this is not what we want. And they show us a Pinterest image of what they actually want. And it's a terrible image. And we find a way to, along the process, to a certain extent, educate them into a certain kind of architecture. And this is not taught in school. So this is something you learn with time. But the point is, you need to provide a student the notion that for example, that's what I told our students this year. What we are doing this year is very funny, and it's what you're doing now. Next year, you're going to get something else. The year after, you're going to get something else. And in the end, it's not about choosing which teacher taught you best. It's about being critical enough to understand what you take from each of them to create your own approach. And then on top of this, you add experience. So the more experience you have, the more, because the education of an architect ends when he dies. It doesn't end when he finishes his diploma. So most of the students will finish their course without knowing what an execution project is, without knowing how to deliver a permit, without even knowing how to fold an A1 page for a permit. So if this is going to happen, you need to assume that you don't know everything when you have a diploma. And I know that now, and I can assure you, if I talk with myself in 10 years, I'm going to find out how much I don't know now that I thought I do, because, conditions change. So not giving a method, not giving a project answer, it's about putting, the student in the condition where he finds it himself.
Ceci, creo que hay una pregunta en el chat.
Sí, estaba a punto de leer. Gracias. Federico Ferrari pregunta, sus obras funcionan casi como un manifiesto a lo cotidiano, lo íntimo. ¿Cómo trabajan estos temas cuando les toca cambiar a una escala mayor en sus obras? O a otro programa.
It's also a question we were asked sometime before. And I honestly don't know. I'm curious. Of course, we want to build other buildings. We don't want to just build houses. If we have to build single-family houses forever, I think we are fine with it. But I can also assume that I think we will be a bit sad because we never tried public, I don't know, a museum or a school. But I honestly don't know. I think I want to believe that we're going to follow the same line of thought. Maybe we're going to evolve it. Maybe it's like with the students when we shift the project, so it's going to force us to re-question our priorities. But I don't know. I want it a lot. We want it a lot. But right now, it seems like we know the projects we have on the table. We have 5 more years of single-family houses on the way. But we don't have yet any promise of a public project of any sorts. And in Portugal, we're not going to get any because the public commissions in Portugal, well, we are outdated and corrupt in many ways. So they are all given. It's very complicated, very complicated.
Bueno, Federico, no sé si eso responde, pero supongo que sí. Kevin Petinari había preguntado si sería correcto decir que uno de los principales motivadores de su manera de proyectar es la búsqueda de que sus obras imiten la ligereza de una imagen.
And that's a very poetic. That's a very poetic reading. Thank you. I think I hope so. I mean, So, what's the name of the student?
Kevin.
So I assume you never visited any of our buildings. This is my first guess. The same way I never visited, I think, any building from Niemeyer. That does not mean I don't know a lot of his work. And I think in our case, it's the same. Most of the people that know our work, most of the people that buy a book of ours or that watch a lecture of ours, they only know images. They know images on our website, on a magazine, on a lecture. So, and they know the images presented either by the text we write for the publications or by me or Anne or Ahmed presenting. So they always get the half full glass. They always get that kind of, and I think, for example, when we were invited by 2G to do our monography, one of the things we asked all the guests that wrote texts was to come to Portugal and to visit the buildings because we wanted to have their feedback on that. And it was really interesting because the texts changed drastically. We saw the text before and we saw the text after. And the text changed drastically in the direction of talking about how the construction happens, the experience on site, and so on. So to answer your question literally, yes, I think at this stage, mostly in your perspective, that's unavoidable. The images become light and become the final result. But in reality, if one day you have the opportunity, and I would be very happy to show you the projects on site, you will probably get a different feeling because I don't agree with that reading. I understand where it comes from, but when I visit the buildings, I like to believe, and I do believe so, that there's more to them than just that lightness of the bidimensional representation. But because of the collages and because of the current divulgation, let's say, it could be seen like that, but it's a misleading reading, I would say.
Bien. Tengo prendido el micrófono. Bien, sí, ya iremos. De algún modo iremos. Otra pregunta que me parece que es interesante, que creo que no se habló, es de Fernando Piotto, que dice, en varios proyectos se observa la aparición de columnas o elementos estructurales en los distintos espacios habitables, a los cuales se le agrega un valor por su color o su revestimiento, es decir, se les otorga calidad visual. A partir de esto, ¿de qué forma proyectan la estructura de los proyectos? Pienso en esta casa donde está esta contraposición tan grande entre la columna principal que sostiene la casa y esta columna que es como más conceptual, que no llega al techo y está delimitando un espacio. En relación a eso, ¿hay un momento de proyectar la estructura de cada obra?
Sí. Yes. Everyone knows the library from Michelangelo. It's a beautiful building. That staircase, those columns, none of them is structural. But that's fine, because it's Michelangelo. He can do whatever he wants. Michelangelo is free to do what he wants. If you go to Caesar, you have a lot of elements, for example, in the Porto school, that look like structural columns that are just columns to bring the rain pipes down so that no one sees rain pipes on the facade. Not structural, but perfectly fine. And then you have a lot of examples in Shinohara, for example, where he does structural columns, so columns that are actually holding the building, and he moves them in positions that make them feel like they are not structural columns. A kind of different reading. So the first thing I would like to say after these three examples is, we as architects need to claim the column as an architectural device and not leave it to the engineers. Because it seems that the engineers, they put a flag on the moon, you know, like they put a flag on the columns and they said, columns are structure. And I'm going to argue that long before structure being structure, structure is architecture. So if a structure defines a retaining wall or a column or whatever, it is defining architecture before it defines anything. We architects request engineer to design the structure. We don't get structures and then we put architecture into them. That's the other way around. So if the column is architecture before being structure, you can have a column that does not need to hold anything. You can have a window that is not facing the sea, and you can have a sloped roof that is not because of the rain. You can just play with these symbolical gestures. And to us, the column is a minimum condition of a wall. If you imagine a column that holds nothing, like all walls do, there's no retaining walls in our buildings, but no one complains that they are not structural. A column can do exactly the same thing. So you can have a wall that just separates space A from space B without being structural, and you can have a column that punctuates a room or separates a certain place from another one that is not structural. What is truly important for us is that if a column is not structural, that we find a way to somehow make it clear that's the case. We don't want to have a column that is doing an architectural game, so separating two spaces, that is seen as a mistake of the engineer. Like, the architect was terrible and he didn't think about it, so he put a column in the middle of the room. It's exactly the opposite. The architect put a column in the middle of the room, it doesn't touch the ceiling, precisely so that you understand that this column is here not to hold the ceiling. And I think that's very important. We cannot keep giving architectural elements to engineers, because otherwise one day we are not doing architecture anymore, we are just doing engineering.
Bárbaro, genial. ¿Alguien tiene alguna otra pregunta, alguna última pregunta como para ir cerrando? ¿Algo que quieran decir?
Yo no tengo pregunta, tengo como agradecimiento porque por lo menos personalmente fue súper motivador para mí. Es como un poco de aire fresco, de otras miradas que me súper motivó, así que estoy muy agradecida.
Gracias.
Yo también, si puedo decir algo de eso, creo que acá en Argentina se ve mucho el tema del hormigón visto en los interiores, que a mí personalmente me da como cierta frialdad, y los interiores así tan coloridos, como con esas especies de atmósfera que quieren hacer, me gustan un montón. Así que me da como ganas, es motivador.
Bueno, Filip, te quiero, primero agradecerte el tiempo, la disposición y la generosidad. A los estudiantes también. Realmente para nosotros es un placer escucharlo, y me parece que también es esto, que puedan escuchar más voces y pensar y seguir pensando sobre arquitectura, bueno, que es lo que nos convoca a nosotros como docentes, y desde este área, y por ahí poder, que a veces historia es una materia medio secundaria, todos deben, en todas las escuelas de arquitectura rige la dictadura de proyecto, o sea, todas esas materias, pero bueno, para nosotros siempre, digamos, por lo menos desde cómo pensamos como historias de proyecto, ¿no? Como son los arquitectos fuimos desafiando problemas de arquitectura, entonces me parece súper interesante que estés acá, lo cuentes así, y que bueno, que podamos conversar sobre esto, porque se trata de esto, de hablar de arquitectura en proyecto, en historia, en otras materias, y ver cómo vamos pudiendo profundizar en esa reflexión. Así que te agradezco muchísimo, súper atento y súper interesante, tanto bueno, el trabajo de ustedes y el ejercicio que están haciendo. Por lo menos las cosas que se veían y que se ven ahí en el Instagram son muy buenas.
Muito obrigado.
Sí, ojalá puedan subir, Daniel, esto va más que nada para vos que hablaste en representación de turma. Ojalá puedan seguir subiendo, queremos ver qué pasa el año que viene también.
Claro que sí, la verdad es que nosotros también estamos emocionados por eso. Sentimos ahí esa motivación que queremos llegar allá y hacer las cosas diferentes también. Muchas gracias por los buenos deseos y para ustedes también, por allá en Argentina también.
Gracias.
Bueno, adiós.
Muchas gracias a todos y gracias, Filipe.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.